Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review the first three episodes of Resident Alien. So, I would kind of say that this show kind of feels fairly random when looking at it. Uh, we really have it to where really we have, for the most point, it's kind of a stereotypical kind of show, but ultimately has quite a bit of sense of humor that I guess we can kind of give it a little bit of like, okay, let's see eventually where this show goes. It's fairly odd. When looking at it currently at the second of this recording, you can watch this show ultimately on a app called Peacock. Or ultimately on some other kind of means or something like that. I saw that there's quite a couple apps that ultimately might have probably all road leads to Peacock, but if anything, we can also end up having it to where anybody could go onto an app like a Movie Pro or a Movie Playbox or something like that and ultimately watch this show as well, ultimately for free. So ultimately, what is this show about? For those of you who do not know, we end up having it to where seemingly there is an alien that ends up crash landing on Earth to eventually become someone, to eventually find out that that someone ultimately is an actual doctor. So we end up having it to where reasonably this alien who eventually has to uh, seemingly become a part of this town ultimately becomes the town doctor, because ultimately it seems that this town's resources are very fairly limited, and so ultimately we have it to where the alien Harry ultimately has to go and become this town's doctor, but not only that, eventually is to seemingly become a person that is going to eventually be a part of this town, whether he wants to or not. It seems that ultimately he is going to eventually be making friends within these episodes and eventually go on maybe quite possibly dates or stuff along those lines. It seems that bizarrely no one is finding Harry off putting, even though really Harry is a off putting individual. Eventually, the entire time we are to ultimately see, in most of the time, reflections, Harry's real alien face, identity, whichever. And it seems that also there are times when ultimately there are certain people in the town that ultimately can see Harry for who he really and truly is, a alien. And so we end up having it to where there are interesting interactions via that. And so yeah, I thought that this show was really interesting for putting that together. We end up having it to where reasonably in this show, we end up having it to where Harry is trying to assimilate onto town, and really that's all that I have really left to say that ultimately is in any cryptic like sense of this episode. It's only three episodes, and it seems that probably a lot of this might be fairly short to go into. It seems like there's some interesting characters, like the sheriff is kind of a little bit of a bizarrish character at some points in time. Um, but also he is kind of also the comic relief at some points in time too. But yeah, other than that, kind of really we have it to where we end up having almost this doctor almost having to almost solve crimes, also kind of trying to figure out what ended up happening uh, with a certain person in this town. And so we end up having to eventually that there is a whole seemingly an investigation that Harry goes and tries to do himself to otherwise try and figure things out. So I think that's all that I wanted to say in a very spoiler or a very cryptic like sense within this show. And so let's go into the spoiler time, because ultimately, I thought that this show was just kind of okay. like I wouldn't go out of my way to say that like people need to absolutely go and watch this show. I just honestly would just recommend it just because it's a new show, it's something different. Um, but a lot of people may not feel so. A lot of people might just be like, "Eh, it's funny," but so let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil these episodes. So we end up having it to ultimately. Uh, Harry is to Harry the alien ultimately crashes onto Earth to ultimately seemingly find the very closest person to become. And ultimately, we end up having it to where this alien is ending up having to basically have a fight out with Harry. And ultimately, like, we end up having it to where the alien ends up going and basically, like, crushing Harry. And ultimately just chucking him into the icy waters. And so we end up having to where Harry ends up kind of just or the alien ends up going and changing his body into being a human, and so he doesn't quite understand the human language, so he ends up going and watching Law and Order repetitiously, picking up words here and there to eventually, after a repetitious amount of times, ridiculously enough, we end up having to eventually Harry is copying every little thing that ultimately a Law and Order episode is saying, word for word. So we end up having to where really Harry is within this first episode, or in these early episodes, we end up having to where Harry is tying everything into Law and Order, even to the point of when they ultimately go and do the dun dun in these episodes, or in the Law and Order episodes, we have it to where Harry kind of ties in the dun dun through what he ends up doing. So we end up having to where eventually Harry is thrusted into the position of ending up having to figure out what had happened to the previous town's head doctor. We end up having to where Harry ends up coming in and finding out that seemingly the town's doctor had died. And so we end up having to where Harry ends up mentioning that, like, well, this guy died by killing himself, by stabbing himself. And so we end up having to where the other doctor, Astra, ultimately is very skeptical about this because ultimately she's like, no, there's no way that he would have done himself in. He's a really good, nice man, so on and so forth. There's no way that this guy is right. So we end up having it to ultimately they end up doing an autopsy, and so we end up having it to where Astra is ultimately watching this guy, Harry, ultimately doing this autopsy, and so we end up having it to where this alien doctor, like, how is it exactly that he knows how to do all of this procedure and stuff like that? We end up having to where I think at some points in time Astra is like directing him on what to do, but it seems that ultimately a lot of times the alien would ultimately mention that he is much smarter than seemingly humans are, ultimately repetitiously mentioning how dumb they are and so on and so forth with some of the stuff that they do. So we end up having it to where Harry ends up completely 100% dissecting this doctor, and eventually he ends up coming up with a consensus later that ultimately what had actually happened to him. Um, but eventually we have it to where seemingly Astra is just kind of really warming up to Harry and ultimately saying like, "Hey man, like I know that you didn't really want any part um, of doing this procedure or anything along those lines, but thank you for at least going and doing this." And ultimately, Harry's like, oh, "Okay, well, yeah, that's no problem." So we end up having it to ultimately in these earlier on episodes, we end up having some kid ultimately in town ultimately noticing that Harry is an alien. He can actually see him through his form. And so we end up having to eventually that Harry is now kind of terrified. This one kid can see that he's really and truly an alien. And so we end up having to eventually that Harry is going and seeking out this kid to try and kill him while he's sleeping. We end up having to where, like, Harry's main goal is to eventually figure out a way for this kid to die because it seems that every single time more and more people are coming and finding um, out that Harry is an alien via this kid ultimately trying to get other people that can quite possibly see that this guy is an alien to kind of group together and so on and so forth. And so Harry's like, God, I gotta kill this kid. And ultimately, I gotta get milk. So we end up having it to a reasonably so, but kind of tailoring back. So we end up having it to eventually that uh, and eventually this kid ends up going and uh, like basically seemingly sounding crazy to his parents, and ultimately have to kind of comfort him, and ultimately saying like, "Aren't you a little old to be getting nightmares and stuff like that?" And ultimately we end up having to where his mother ultimately is to tell his father, it's like, "Man, I know you shouldn't have been having him watch horror movies." And ultimately the father says, "E.T.'s not a horror movie." So we end up having it to where ultimately uh, their son is to end up going and sleeping with them in their bed, while ultimately actually the alien is right underneath the bed, ultimately going and thinking that he's going to have to spring into action to kill both of this kid's parents. So we end up having it to where ultimately uh, Astra and Harry are to basically celebrate a seemingly job well done, and so ultimately they go out. They go out on the town. They go out to a bar to ultimately bump into some bartender that ultimately is going to start giving them drinks and having her drink as well. You get this heavily montage of like of everyone starting to drink. Eventually, they end up popping in some music, and everybody has to sing and start dancing along with it. We eventually also have it to where Harry eventually is bizarrely doing some kind of thing that seems like dancing. And interesting enough, it seems that people are kind of interested in his dancing. So we eventually have it to where within these episodes, we end up having it to where uh, eventually Astra ultimately has a father that seems to, I would assess, maybe be Native American of sorts. It seems that ultimately he is a person that like is a person that can kind of read people, not like meaning like he can kind of sense them or sense things about them. And ultimately, when Astra ultimately goes to her father, is like, "Hey, what do you sense about this guy?" Because it seems that Astra is kind of taking a liking to him, and Astra's father ultimately used to say, like, "I don't sense anything at all from this guy." Isn't that, and that's kind of weird. So we end up having to eventually that bizarrely in one part of some episodes we end up having it to where Astra ends up cutting her hair. Didn't quite understand why that was even a thing in this episode, but eventually it ends up happening. So we end up having it to where ultimately we have an entire episode that ultimately is to have Harry being forced into being the town's doctor, ultimately to where he is to go and start seeing patients. And ultimately, the entire time he's Googling what the heck to even try to do, or try to have the internet try to diagnose things for him, and so on and so forth. we end up having to where eventually Harry had problems sleeping and he could not sleep, and he ends up kind of complaining that ultimately why is it that all humans have to sleep. Um, and ultimately, Harry wanted to actually try and sleep but couldn't. So we end up having to where Harry eventually is to learn all kinds of things about being a doctor, while having numerous hours to just kind of research and whatever. So we end up having to eventually Harry's going in and diagnosing everyone, and we eventually have it to where Astra is kind of giving him the heads up of like, you know what, maybe you should actually have like a nice bedside manner to some of these people, you know? Like try to be nice to some of them. We end up having to where there's one much older man that ultimately we end up having it to where Harry tells this man exactly how it is that ultimately he's probably going to have maybe months to live. And ultimately the old man is like, oh, thank God. Like, thank God somebody told me it's straight. And so we end up having to where Harry is like he's winning over some people, but then also he is kind of making people very uncomfortable by saying a certain set of words that could probably offend somebody, or otherwise just tick someone off. So we end up having to eventually Harry is to eventually go about his day, and we eventually have a tour. Like I said, eventually Harry is to go after this kid, Max, who seems to uh, be bringing other kids that ultimately can see that this guy is an alien, to a diner that ultimately Harry's at. We ultimately have it to eventually Harry also goes and tries to trick Max, and ultimately that trickery does not work. We ultimately end up eventually having it to where eventually Max, within these 3 episodes, eventually ends up having to go to the doctor because he ends up having a sore throat of sorts. And we end up having to where Max goes to the doctor to realize it's Harry that is the physician there, and ultimately Max will not go. He'll be like, nope, nope, I'm not going to have an alien ultimately try to help me or cure me or whatever. But eventually we end up having it to where Max ultimately ends up cutting open his arm, and so Harry is trying to sew it up without having one lick of Novocaine for Max to have, to ultimately kind of numbs up the arm or whatever. So we end up having to eventually the alien is just so maxed up, you can kind of tell the twinge and the pain that ultimately Max is in, and then ultimately the alien is trying to make the pain even worse by basically stretching the stitches and all kinds of things. But eventually, we end up having to where ultimately, excuse me, we end up having to where eventually the doctor is to be played because we end up having it to where Max ultimately tells the alien that, hey, like your shoe's untied, and ultimately the doctor looks, and ultimately we end up having it to where the doctor unties his shoe, told me to say, yeah, my shoe is untied, look. So we end up having it to where eventually uh, the mayor ended up telling Harry that he is to become uh, the resident doctor, and so eventually we have it to where eventually Harry ends up figuring out what had happened with the original doctor. That the original doctor ultimately had tried to put a trachea into his throat, but it didn't work in time to save his life. We end up finding out that ultimately Harry has to open up the coffin at this guy's funeral to ultimately acknowledge that uh, this guy was giving himself a trachea because he had been poisoned, and the poison was clogging up his throat to otherwise make him choke and die. So we end up having it to where eventually that Harry's to tell Astra this, and she's like, "Oh my god, somebody had killed the original Doctor," and ultimately Harry's like, "Yeah." So we end up having it to where eventually we have the sheriff ending up and finding a foot of sorts, a foot that is ultimately nearby a lake that ultimately Harry had tossed, um, seemingly his previously harried body, um, when ultimately the alien had killed Harry and tossed him in of course the ocean, or tossed him in the lake or whatever. We end up having to ultimately there's an entire episode dedicated to basically finding this body, and we end up having to where Harry's trying as desperately as possible to scramble to get his other hairy body and try to hide it somehow, which I thought was really hilarious. So we end up having it to where ultimately news is spread about a body being found, and ultimately it's not actually a body, it's a foot. And so we end up having it to where Harry ends up going to uh, where all the townspeople are, to ultimately say, like, hey, like, what body did you find? Because we end up having it to where Harry's like, well, what am I going to say if ultimately they do find my original body? Well, I'll just say that I have a twin brother. Bizarrely. So we eventually have to where seemingly in this episode, Harry is to go and put out all the stops and try and find this body and eventually try and hide this body from everyone. And so we eventually have it to where Harry ends up going and tossing this body into a refrigerator and ultimately tossing a bunch of meat on it. Eventually, it seems that ultimately the sheriff's drug dog ended up sniffing out this uh, this refrigerator that ultimately had all kinds of meat in it. That wasn't human meat. It was actually just legitimately like some kind of food meat. And so, anyways, we end up having to eventually that Harry basically goes out of his way to kind of be able to slip away without anybody knowing about this whole body situation. So we eventually have it to where ultimately I think that's kind of just all that really happens within these first three episodes. Uh, I kind of commingled some things or didn't really quite go in depth about certain other things. But yeah, that is to really be what all happens within a bulk of this episode. The more important things, if anything, there is one point in time where we end up having to where Harry ends up talking uh, to certain people like the mayor and almost trying to be a doctor slash therapist. Ultimately ending up asking uh, the mayor certain questions, and then eventually he ends up getting interrupted by somebody kind of messing with his job, and so ultimately Harry goes out of his way to eventually be uh, eventually goes out of it. Eventually goes and figures out what all that racket is, so that way he can be able to perform his doctor duties. Because we end up having to where Harry's consistently pulled away from things, or Harry's otherwise um, consistently having people asking him like stupid, dumb questions uh, to kind of get him away from what he is doing, and so on and so forth. So we really have it to where there's some times where Harry's really getting down in the dirty of uh, really actually being a pretty decent doctor, and everybody's really enjoying Harry being a part of this town. It doesn't really seem like there's any one person that is kind of really sniffing out that Harry is an alien besides a kid or two, and we end up having to where Harry is not going and killing any human beings and eating them. So like it's not like any real true legitimate accidents are gonna have any happen anytime soon. So we also eventually end up finding out that seemingly that Harry is to have also left his ship out in the lake, and so eventually Harry ends up having to ask, like the bartender that ultimately he had gotten drunk with before, "Hey, when does snow melt?" Because ultimately we end up having to where Harry's trying to figure out exactly when he is to try and hide this ship from anyone, because ultimately having snow covering his ship doesn't exactly quite hide it exactly. So eventually Harry is going to have to scramble and come up with something to be able to hide said ship. So really, I think I kind of covered all my bases with the exception of some stuff here and there. But yeah, I think so far this show is an enjoyable thing to watch, even though, again, people could feel differently about it. Like, I wouldn't go out of my way to recommend it, but when looking at it, also, there's some people that might just need any number of things to be able to watch recently. And this might be it. So, with that, I think I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.